The 1990s were a golden age for video games. You know, the usual suspects: Doom, Quake, Half-Life, Unreal Tournament, and way more. It was a decade of innovation, pushing the boundaries of technology further and further. But as the 90s came to a close, and games got even more ambitious, expectations were higher than ever. Expectations that some games ultimately just weren't able to meet. Among those many titles, one stands out in particular for just how anticipated it was, being created by one of the most iconic figures in the FPS gaming industry. From spending company funds on luxury cars, to the very ambitious title with so much promise that ultimately ended up being a total failure. So let's take a dive into the odd history behind Daikatana, and the downfall of the company behind the game, infamously considered as one of the biggest disappointments in FPS history. Following the release and subsequent success of Quake in 1996, id Software was definitely proving themselves as a standout studio throughout the 90s, but it wasn't all smooth sailing at the company. Throughout Quake's development, tensions would grow between two of its co-founders, John Carmack and John Romero. Of course, two very talented developers in their own right, but each having different concepts for the direction of the project. The final outline for Quake was a game that largely aimed to build upon the intuitive, fast, and fluid FPS formula that had been outlined with their prior titles. Although Romero had a desire to incorporate more RPG elements to the game, which aligned much more with the original concepts for Quake. It's not well known, but in its early stages, Quake wasn't really supposed to be an FPS. It was to feature mechanics like melee-focused combat and RPG elements, inspired by the staff's private D&D game at the time. As development continued, the team had troubles working these concepts into their new engine. Ultimately becoming burnt out, they decided focusing on the more familiar FPS design would be the better option, a change that Romero would reluctantly agree to at the time, but he would eventually leave id Software due to this in 1996. Romero moved on to co-found Ion Storm alongside Tom Hall later that year in Dallas, Texas. With some well-known names at the helm, word about Ion Storm would spread quickly in the industry, soon signing a licensing deal with Eidos Interactive to develop a handful of games, even opening a second studio in Austin, Texas, headed by Warren Spector of Ultima and System Shock fame. The outlook for the company was positive, and it seemed like Ion Storm was on a quick path to success. Of course, as many of you can imagine, this wouldn't exactly be the case. While the newer studio in Austin would focus mostly on the Eidos projects, their main studio in Dallas would have their own IP in the works. Originally announced in 1997, Daikatana was supposed to be a groundbreaking title, an FPS featuring those RPG mechanics, advanced AI, innovative graphics and technology, the list goes on. The ideas presented for the game made it seem like it was destined to be a standout title. John Romero's design document for the game from early 1997 proposed a wealth of content. 64 unique enemy monsters, 12 different weapons, 24 levels spanning 4 different time periods, and the list goes on. Literally, I mean, the design document was supposedly over 400 pages long. Not only that, Romero estimated the game could be completed by the end of the year, a projection that even John Carmack doubted at the time. And with Ion Storm being such a new company, it didn't help that they were experiencing a few growing pains of their own, to say the least. The company hired quite a few amateur Quake modders to fill out their development team, most of whom, of course, were talented but lacked the industry experience to handle such a project. The company also had some very interesting problems with management, reportedly spending over $2 million on a penthouse for their headquarters in Dallas. Not to mention, the company's CEO, Mike Wilson, would be dismissed for spending $30 grand on a new BMW using company funds, and nearly 50 employees would resign following the dismissal of Bob Wright, one of the co-founders of the company. The extent of this sort of spending of company funds wasn't uncommon for the time with the dot-com bubble problems, but all these issues combined together ultimately added a lot of strain onto the company. The game would first be shown at E3 in 1997, and with it mostly being in an early state, it ultimately didn't draw in many viewers. Ironically, the company had licensed the Quake engine from id Software for the project, and speaking of id Software, their new demo at E3 the same year was a much different story, showing off Quake 2 in its brand new engine, supporting dynamic colored lighting and hardware acceleration to boot, ultimately making Daikatana's technology seem underwhelming and now dated, still running on the first iteration of the engine. They would actually try and license the Quake 2 engine following this, but id Software's contract stipulated that they wouldn't be able to provide a license until after the release of Quake 2 in late 1997, so they would have to wait, eventually acquiring the license in early 1998. Switching their engine mid-development would just prove to cause more issues, even with the improvements in the game's tech and visual quality. It resulted in major delays and forced the team to rework much of what they had already done. The development process dragged on for years, plagued by technical issues, management missteps, and a ballooning budget. To add on to all this, they still had to work on the Eidos titles, thus making the development of Daikatana run in parallel with development of other games. Ion Storm's development teams were stretched thin over the course of the next few years, causing work on Daikatana to just drag constantly. Despite all that, there were still fans excitedly awaiting the game's eventual release, of course being unaware of the issues at the studio at the time, and unfortunately what they got was nothing like they had originally anticipated. As time passed, with the studio's developers being bounced around between other projects from Eidos, the game would not be released in 1997, nor 1998, or even 1999. Upon its eventual release in May of 2000, the game was almost immediately met with negative reviews across the board from both critics and gamers. Reviewers citing many issues from general gameplay bugs to underwhelming graphics and presentation, and most of those that played it referred to the game as simply mediocre. Some critics even going as far to rate Daikatana as one of the worst games of that year. By July, the game had only sold just over 8,000 copies in the United States, massively missing its projected sales figures, ultimately leading the game's release to be considered as a total disaster. Strangely enough, the game would also receive a port for the Nintendo 64 developed by Kemco, which suffered much of the same fate in terms of its reception and general issues. Even further, it would receive an alternate version for the Game Boy Color, which was only released in limited quantities in Europe due to a lack of consumer interest. Ironically, this version not only had the best reception of the three, it was actually quite highly rated, and is now considered a collector's item due to its rarity. As with my other videos, they're largely meant to be about showcasing a game's history and legacy, whether positive or negative, so my personal thoughts take a back seat here, but I figured with so much negativity about it, I had to see what it was all about for myself. So $8 Canadian and a whopping 600 megabytes later, I began my journey into John Romero's infamous Daikatana, a journey that admittedly would not last very long. As for its plot, you play as the sword-wielding protagonist Hiro Miyamoto, accompanied by his two companions who must prevent the evil Kaje Mishima from using the powerful Daikatana sword to take over the world, or something like that. You travel through 4 different time periods ranging from Japan in the 2400s all the way back to Greece in 1200 BC. Now, running on the Quake 2 engine and seemingly not doing a whole lot different in a mechanical sense, the game of course felt similar to that of Quake, but with its own unique quirks, you could say. The controls overall were largely panned by reviewers, not because the control scheme itself was bad, but because it just generally feels unresponsive. Mouse control is somewhat jittery at best, and the character movement was more like sliding and bouncing rather than running and jumping, making it feel generally clunky in comparison to the usual freeing movement offered by the Quake engine. To be fair, Quake being much more popular has allowed it to be patched and modernized over the years from its original MS-DOS and Windows versions. However, Daikatana does have an unofficial patch that fixes a number of gameplay issues, but I made a commitment to not use it so I could have as close to a vanilla experience as I could with the game. Either way, within 5 to 10 minutes of the first level, I was pretty much met with everything negative I had already heard about it. The strange movement, poor hit detection, odd level design, and some of the most annoying enemy sounds I'd ever heard in a video game to date. And to sum those first few minutes up, I could echo pretty much everything that was said by both critics and community here, and it largely doesn't instill much confidence in how the rest of the game may go. Quite possibly the largest difference between Quake and Daikatana that was cited by many is that the latter tries to bring a focus in on melee combat, something that the engine's mechanics largely weren't designed for. Quake's general movement is quick and responsive, allowing the player to dance around the enemy, shooting and dodging in rapid succession. Using a system that functions in such a fast-paced way without really changing the mechanics to suit it just didn't work. While it's certainly playable, its general issues and overall mediocre design and atmosphere didn't really help the appeal all that much. The game's poor reception, coupled with the strain on the development teams due to the combined lack of experience and other contract projects, would eventually lead Romero and Hall to leave the company in mid-2001, with Eidos moving to shut down Ion Storm's original Dallas office. At the very least, the company would see some success with their Austin-based studio's work on the original Deus Ex for Eidos, a game that was praised for its innovations at the time and is still widely regarded to this day. Once their contract with Eidos was complete, they would move to shut down the Austin studio as well, effectively dissolving Ion Storm as a company. Although the game is largely regarded as one of the worst shooters of all time, there were at the very least some people that saw through its issues and tried to enjoy it, even having a small community to this day. In the end, Daikatana was a promising game that unfortunately suffered a multitude of issues, not just in its development, but with the entire company as a whole. At the very least, the game showed ambition in its ideas for the time. When researching into some of the concepts Romero initially had for the project, it's pretty interesting to think what might have come of it had circumstances been different. But hey, $8 for an old game isn't so bad, even if the experience itself, well, kind of was.